welcome to Tattva Conversations and Explorations. For our fourth episode on biology, we sat down with Professor Charles Lineweaver. Professor Lineweaver is an associate professor at the Australian National University's Planetary Science Institute, a joint venture of the ANU Research School of Astronomy and Astrophysics and Research School of Earth Science. His research involves analysis of the statistical distribution of exoplanets, the cosmic microwave background radiation, the cosmological prerequisites for the formation of terrestrial planets and life. He's a member of the editorial board of Astrobiology Magazine and the author of more than 60 papers published in scientific journals or in volumes of collected works. We talked about the meaning of astrobiology, how his work has influenced his life, the evolutionary basis of morals, ethics, meaning, when science and tradition collides, the meaning of intelligence, value of faith, and alien life. We hope this conversation can help the listeners see the tattva, or true essence of biology, and its potential to help us understand how life came to be and the various ways in which it evolves with and through humans, as well as all other living beings. Hello, Dr. Lineweaver. Welcome to Tattva.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
I'm so happy. We are so happy to have you with us. So we've been watching a lot of your work online, some of the interviews that you've done, your TEDx talk, some of the articles that you've written, and we'll get into all of that. But my first question is the most basic one. I'd like to understand from you, what is astrobiology?
Well, you know what astronomy is, and you know what biology is. Biology has to do with the life on Earth, and astronomy has to do with stars. I'm more of a cosmobiologist, and that is in the sense that I was trained as a cosmologist. There's a slight distinction between cosmology and biology. Between cosmology and astronomy. Astronomers know a lot about stars, but cosmologists know a lot about the whole universe and the origin of the universe. For example, I did my thesis in studying the cosmic microwave background radiation. This is the oldest radiation you can see. You know, if you look at the moon, you're looking back in time about a second. If you look at the sun, you're looking back in time about 8 minutes. If you look at Andromeda, for example, you're looking back about 2 million years. So as an astronomer, as a cosmologist or an astronomer, looking through a telescope, you're looking back in time. You're actually seeing what was happening 2 million years ago, 10 million years ago, 1 billion years ago. And the longest you can go into the past is, if you're looking with photons, is 13.8 billion. And you're looking at the surface of last scattering. That surface of last scattering has hot spots and cold spots. And in 1992, or actually it was 1994, we announced that we had found hot spots and cold spots in this oldest radiation you could see. And that got my PhD supervisor, George Smoot, the Nobel Prize in 2006. So I have a background in data analysis of cosmological data, trying to understand the entire universe. On the other hand, my dad was a high school biology teacher. And I love biology, and I've read, for example, I have like 20 books by Stephen Jay Gould and 20 books by Richard Dawkins there. So these are people, I've read a lot of biology, and I really like biology. So I know more biology than any cosmologist and more cosmology than any biologist. So I say I'm a cosmobiologist.
Oh, very interesting. That's very nice. So I think one question, usually I keep it for, it's one of the last questions I ask. But since your interest in your subject is so clear, you know, it's almost, you know, I can feel it through this virtual medium. I would like to also ask you, how would you say your understanding, your passion, but essentially your understanding of what biology, cosmology, and the marriage of these two subjects is about, how has that influenced the way you look at the world, yourself, and about, yeah, how you generally interact with the world? Has it influenced it in any way?
I would say not only has it influenced, it is the way I look at the world. That is the way I look at the world, through cosmology and biology. Sometimes I call myself a radical Darwinist, because I look at something and say, why is that leaf that color? Or why is that person altruistic? And everything from science, religion, to dogs, to being an ape, being a vertebrate, trying to understand our place in the universe. All of that is cosmobiology. So I don't think it influences, it is the way I understand it. Matter of fact, if I have any kind of understanding about myself that isn't consistent with that scientific worldview, I say, whoa, where did that come from? And am I being just vain about this? Usually it has to do with vanity and thinking you're really, really important. And then you compare yourself and you try to understand how humans got here. And then you say, okay, we're vertebrates, we're apes, we're eukaryotes. And then you find yourself a place that is not so self-serving, that's scientifically based rather than, I guess, vanity based. Or, some people think that they can come up with their own morality by just sitting there and thinking. And I say, no. All of these ethics that we have been selected for over millions and millions of years. And that's the way I understand my own ethics and morality. And people who think that they can just sit there and invent it is just deluding themselves, I think. So so as you can see, I take a cosmology and biology and essentially Darwinism as a way to understand everything. And sometimes usually that works, but it also is very provocative in many ways.
What I'm also hearing is that if ethics and morality, these are two topics that I feel they seem to be very difficult to understand or define for a lot of people, even to themselves. But if you're saying they have a biological basis, so to speak, would you say then?
I would say evolutionary biology basis. So there are things that, for example, imagine you have two tribes, and one tribe said, boy, I'm the most important thing in the world. And the other tribe says, well, I'm not so important. Well, this tribe that thinks that they're important will do whatever they can to stay alive, and then they will survive. And so that explains why we think we are so important. So that's just a simple example of an ethical value that is selected for in biology, and how you can explain why you have that value, rather than saying, oh, that's just life. Life thinks it's important.
Okay. So, right. So now that you have these ethical markers in your life, would you say then the ethics that you've chosen, and if they stand in line with what you've come to understand of what ethics as they have evolved among our civilization, does that give you a kind of peace when you have these markers and you are in line with these markers, that you are comfortable with yourself, you're at ease with yourself, you're happy with the decisions that you make in life?
No, I wouldn't say that. The reason is because they're always changing. The environment is always changing. For example, women's rights, for example, this is something that ethically has changed a lot in the last 100 to 200 years. And so you say, well, wait a minute, where did that come from? And you say, well, I don't know where it came from, but it's changing. It has come from the environment somehow, and it's selected probably because muscle work and hand-to-hand combat is not something we do anymore. Now, when there's armies fighting, you have a weapon, and a man or a woman can pull a trigger. And I suspect, for example, maybe women are even better at being snipers, or driving a truck or launching a rocket. So the type of sexual dimorphism that has led to different roles for men and women has gradually disappeared over the last 200 years or so. And with that, we don't need to be that different anymore. So that's the kind of I guess that's the kind of way I would understand changes in ethics, that we're flexible about it, and we need that flexibility because the environment is changing.
Right.
And we are changing the environment. It's a co-evolution.
A co-evolution, right? So I'm sure I'm going to get the terms wrong because I'm not technically astute here, but it sounds like, what you were calling as evolutionary biological ethics, they are kind of giving birth and certainly influencing what might be termed as social ethics.
Of course. I wouldn't say I would say they are social ethics. I would say that there are no moral values that didn't come from this long process of selecting individuals for having different attitudes. I'd say the whole thing it's sometimes called psycho-Darwinism.
Can you please explain the psycho-Darwinism a bit?
So you have attitudes about, you love your child more than you love the neighbor's child, or you love your husband, or how much do you love yourself, or how much do you identify with the group you belong to. All of these are kind of moral, ethical decisions that have been selected for over millions of years by variation in attitudes among different tribal groups. And then when tribal groups have ethical values, that, for example, altruism, you have a guy who says, I'm going to defend my tribe. And if you have too many of those and they all die, well, then your tribe dies out. But if those very, very brave warriors can protect you, then the other people are dead and then you survive. In other words, I think genocide, for example, has played a gigantic role in human evolution. And unfortunately, and it still is with us, for example, xenophobia is something, fear of foreigners. Where did that come from? Probably came from millions of years of having a tribe. You have about 100 kilometers around you. And then on the other side of the mountain or the valley, there's another tribe that you are either friends with or you hate. And when you hate them, you fight, and then they fight. A lot of either your tribe dies or their tribe dies, or there's some kind of cooperation that evolves. So all of these are attitudes towards foreigners that have been evolved. And so a lot of people have xenophobia. Now the world is getting much smaller. People are traveling and say, hey, wait a minute, I understand that tribe. They are people too. And then your in-group gets larger. The question now is, how large can that in-group get? Does it include chimpanzees and gorillas, for example? Does it include fish? When you hear about animal rights, the first weird thing is that we think of ourselves as not animals. And I'm saying, well, that's crazy. I know as a Darwinist, we are definitely animals. And so the whole idea of degrading and stigmatizing animals is just silly to me. Anyway, I'll stop there and let you ask another question.
First of all, Doctor, please feel free to reconcile as long as your answers you want them to be. I don't mind. That's not a problem. But there is something I'd like to, something that came to mind. I've heard this phrase. It says, people don't have ideas, ideas have people. So,
yeah.
Right. Is it in line with what you're saying? Maybe it's not.
No, it's not. It's not because coevolution, ideas and people are evolving together, just like dogs and people have evolved together. You could say, who's in control, the dogs or people? No, the dogs help people, people help dogs, and so there's a complementarity that has evolved and co-evolved. So it's not one or the other. So the same thing with ideas and, what did you say, ideas and
people don't have ideas, ideas have people.
Yeah, so, I don't. That's a dichotomy that I would reject, because in like many dichotomies, it's better described as a coevolution between ideas or evolving. Well, first of all, there's no such thing as an idea outside of people's brains, and so people's brains are having various ideas, and then they get selected. Some ideas are good ones, and if they're good and they help that tribe survive, then that tribe will proliferate and get a larger area. And if you have a silly idea that says, hey, let's murder all the children, that would be a very bad idea, and you wouldn't survive very. So I use a radical Darwinist lens to view everything, essentially.
Right. So say a child is born, okay, and we'll keep it absolutely scientific. A child is born and has the genes of both the parents, genetic endowments of both the parents, so prone to certain kinds of attitudes and prone to perhaps believing in certain kind of things. And then there is the environment, the social environment that the child is born in. Of course, there is food and all of these things involved. But it seems like even when the child is born, while the world is full of possibilities and everything is open to the child, it doesn't seem like everything is open to the child. There are certain things that the child seems to be more prone to, and if the environment provides that and perhaps propagates it, then the child definitely will do better. But if the child is born to a certain set of being prone to certain things, but the environment that he's born in or she's born in does not propagate those as ideal or those as the one that lead to success, then there might be a conflict, and the child's life might become difficult. Really, that happens?
Oh, I agree with that completely. What you've just described is more or less the nature-nurture debate. And the answer, as you've provided, is that it's nature via nurture. Mark Ridley has written a book about this. The idea is you are born with potential, but also strong inclinations. It's kind of like a leash. You're born with a leash, but you can push it here, push it there, depending on your environment, and also depending on your genetic endowment. And that I think is the correct description of a human being's place in the social world and in the environmental world.
We recently spoke to one philosopher of physics, some time ago. His name is Professor Don Rickles. He has written a book, it's called Life is Short. And what he's done is he's drawn inspiration from philosophers of the past, like Seneca, who are saying that death, because we're going to die one day, We're not immortal, so to speak, individual life. We're going to die one day. That gives meaning to life. Now I'm thinking this meaning that we give to life is important now because we are limited in what we'll end up doing because of what tendencies we are born with and what opportunities we might make, we might avail ourselves, right? What does meaning mean to you as a, maybe that's the question, yeah.
Right. Well, you know that example I gave of two tribes. One tribe said, "Oh, my life has meaning." Another tribe says, "No, my life is meaningless." The tribes that said my life is meaningless, so they did not do, they didn't they didn't go the second mile in trying to protect themselves and keep themselves alive.
Right.
So and you see that in all of life, one of the most fundamental features of life is these organisms do what is necessary to stay alive. You know, they'll try very, very hard to stay alive. And so your question is, life is short. Oh, the meaning. So one of the most profound meanings we have is, hey, I think I'm important. I think I'm meaningful. Now that doesn't come from any type of objective analysis of the world, because as you pointed out on some of your other conversations, you know, we are very small. The Earth is very small. Humans are very small. Retina is very small. And so in one sense, science and cosmology is telling you, you are tiny, you are anonymous, you are not that important. On the other hand, you have a brain that says, I am important. And you say, well, how did I get that idea? Where did that come from? That seems very, very natural, not only to me, but to a dog, to that tree out there. And that the reason that is so, the reason that meaning is there is because it has been selected to be there because the people who had it survived.
Yeah.
Nothing else, nothing more than that. And so if you go looking for meaning, first of all, you can ask, why am I asking this question? And I think the answer is you're asking it because you feel that you're meaningful and you want to stay alive. Why is that? Because your ancestors have been selected for. The ones who believed they had some meaning were the ones that survived. So that kind of, for some people, that undermines the whole idea of meaning to their lives. But I think it doesn't undermine it at all. It's just say, hey, you are saying, I am embedded in the biosphere as a product of Darwinian evolution. And that's cool. That's consistent with what should have happened. So I don't find it demeaning to say that your search for meaning has an evolutionary basis rather than some fundamental, you know, more fundamental basis.
So when we say ancestors, doctor, ancestors, so I don't know, with time, have we become slightly limited in how far or how back in the past we can go? But in terms of ancestors, if as an individual, I'm looking for meaning in my life, what are my ancestors? Are they the North Indians? Because I'm from North India, and then how far back in North India? Then there is invasion. Then where did the invasion come from? And then what led to them want to come and invade? Were they the places that they were in? Were they desert-like, and the life wasn't easy? So they're looking for better ways of supporting themselves, like they say, fundamentally that survival. So then my tree of life. Right now, wherever leaf or branch on that tree I am, my tree of life like goes way back. So how do I determine? Because it seems people seem to have very many different meanings to life, very many different meanings to sustain, to keep their feet on the ground and say, yes, I'm going to wake up tomorrow and this is what I'm going to do, and here is why. So this, how do we end up selecting meanings? Again, I think it comes down to where we are born, being prone to certain kind of attitudes anyway. Yeah, like how do we go about selecting our meanings? And I mean, that's a very broad question.
Well, okay, so first of all, David Reich has written a book called Who We Are, How We Are. He's somebody who's looked at some of the genes of the Indians. Now, you portrayed it talking about ancestors, and you had a vision of about maybe 200, 300, 400, 500 years, maybe 2,000 years. As a cosmobiologist, I tend to say, oh, what are my ancestors of 4 billion years? So for me, when I say ancestors, I mean all the way back to the origin of life.
Exactly.
Now, and so because there's so many pieces of who you are, for example, every cell in your body, I mean, about 1 billion years ago, 1.5 billion, our ancestors were single-celled creatures. They were not multicellular. You have more than 100 trillion cells, about 50 trillion cells in your body. They are all cooperating to do what you're doing now, talking to me. So there had to be all kinds of cooperation that had to evolve in order to produce a multicellular organism. But you talked about more specifically about different cultural meanings. It is definitely true that different cultures, there are still, thankfully, maybe 6,000 cultures around the world. Their numbers are dying every single day, every single week. The cultures are being eliminated because of this wonderful thing called the world getting smaller. So it has advantages in that we're increasing the size of our in-group, but the disadvantage is that we're destroying cultures and languages as we speak right now. But back to different cultures. So we have different cultures. These cultures are different precisely because they have evolved in isolation or relative isolation from each other. And therefore, you have this feeling that I have meaning. And then you say, where does that come from? So these cultures make up a story, a very individual story, a very unique story often about here's how people evolved, here's how the universe came to be. And it's based on, I would say, an animistic, I guess, impression of awe and wonder and explanation. You said, why is there thunder, for example? Say, okay, why is there thunder? That's a more objective question rather than meaning. But you say, okay, some people say there's a god of Thor and there's another god of here. And so if you go around the world doing a survey of the different individual cultures of how they explain thunder, they will all be different. But now we have science as a wonderfully unifying thing that says, you know what, we're going to forget about all that stuff. And here's how it does. There's the electrons that are falling, and then we have charge separation. So we have a scientific version. I have confidence in that scientific version. On the other hand, it's really interesting that when scientists go to people who still have a traditional understanding, that scientific understanding is not good for them because it immediately undermines their traditional values in many, many ways. And so we have this gigantic clash between scientists who are geneticists say, hey, I'm here to understand the origin of humanity. Let's take a blood sample and I'm going to tell you where your ancestors came from. They say, we already know where our ancestors came from and we don't want to give you blood samples. So there's this ongoing conflict between science and traditional values. And so I can see this going on. I'm not sure. I'm basically on the side of the scientist because I love to understand. I have more confidence in the scientific understanding than I do in any one traditional one. That's one of the reasons why, I call myself an animistic atheist. So I was brought up as a Unitarian. My mother was once as a Christian and a Quaker. My dad was like I said, a high school biology teacher who wondered about religion. And so I have grown up being a radical Darwin scientific, but because I've traveled a lot, I've seen this conflict between science and religion, and science and traditional values rather. And I don't take the side of science when it comes to pushing traditional groups around, because I think that's crazy, because as I said, you're eliminating a gigantic culture of stories and language that are so rich in so many ways. And people say, well, that's not important because they don't understand how lightning came about. I should stop there. I could go on. I got that. I'll stop. You ask me another question.
No, so here is what I'm hearing. So yes, you said scientific. I believe in scientific understanding. Now I'm thinking understanding, or is it scientific explanation? Because if we take the example of thunder, so the phenomena of thunder, lightning,
yes.
Lightning and thunder. So the phenomena of thunder is undeniable, whether you are coming from a traditional point of view, or you're coming from a religious point of view, or you're coming from a scientific way of looking at things. The phenomena is undeniable. You can see it, right? So now it is a difference in the explanation, right?
Wait, stop. Lightning you can see, thunder you hear.
Oh. Okay. So let's say thunder and lightning, you can observe through your senses, and both these groups, which end up getting into a conflict. Is it a conflict of understanding, a conflict of explanation? I don't know. But the phenomena of thunder and lightning both agree upon, right?
Well, let me, yes, but thunder and lightning, maybe that's a bad example, because when I suspect that when traditional cultures are brought in contact with a scientific understanding of lightning and thunder, their traditional one is not so close to their hearts that they would preserve it. I think that they would say, okay, maybe you are right, and we'll have a lightning rod in our village. But when it comes to the meaning of my life, that's much more close to their hearts. And that's where the pushback comes, not from lightning or medicine, for example. You know, I had a great uncle who was a medical missionary in Korea. And it was interesting because he had modern Western medicine, but at the same time, he had been brought up in Korea. He spoke Korean, and therefore he had respect for the local shamans. So there was some type of interesting mix between, okay, if you want the shaman, here's the shaman, I'll do this. And a lot of people would want to do both because, hey, what's there to lose? Maybe this guy knows more, maybe this guy knows more, I'll try both. And that is in many ways what a lot of traditional societies have, I guess, come to agree on, at least in many aspects, not in terms of Darwinism. I know Darwinism is, I think, still telling people, hey, you are an animal. And people say, I am not an animal. I'm more meaningful than that. And that, I think, is particularly important. Well, it's a battle that's still going on. And I still think most of the world's cultures are pre-Darwinian.
Great. So I read your article. It was titled "A Lonely Universe," and it came in this online magazine. It's called Inference Review. So I'll just read out a quote from your article, and then I'll pose my question based on the quote. You said, Snyder Beatty, did I say that right? Snyder Beatty?
Snyder Beatty, that's the lead author of the paper that I was reviewing, Snyder Beatty.
Right, Snyder Beatty. So they said, quote, they conclude that intelligent life is rare in the universe because it took humans such a long time to evolve all four of the assumed prerequisites. They are abiogenesis, eukaryogenesis, sexual reproduction, and intelligence itself. Now, I don't know if it makes for an appropriate question here, but if this was the order of the appearance of the so-called prerequisites, first comes abiogenesis, eukaryogenesis, sexual reproduction, and then lastly intelligence, why do you think that intelligence was the last to emerge? One, and what is it that we are characterizing as intelligence here? Two, and lastly, are we also saying that the previous three prerequisites, in them that there was an absence of intelligence?
Right. Okay. So in this article, I agree with the conclusion that we are the only human-like intelligence probably in the whole universe. So that I have other reasons. Now, they came to that conclusion using a method that I completely disagree with. That complete disagreement is this idea of there's a sequence of abiogenesis, that's just a fancy word for the origin of life. Mm-hmm. Then eukaryogenesis, that's when things got a nuclear membrane and had a nucleus. Eukaryotes, you and I are eukaryotes, and bacteria and archaea are prokaryotes. But the whole point is, what these physicists have done is taken the tree of life, which goes in so many different, millions, billions of different directions. It's a lovely variety. And then they say, what is my lineage? And they look back at our lineage, the human lineage, and then say, this particular lineage out of the billions of possible lineages, even more than billions, this lineage that has resulted in me is something that is somehow a universal lineage. It's as if you believe in we can trace the origin of the English language that we're speaking right now. It's a very complicated and quirky thing. And then imagine somebody says, you know what? I think that this lineage, of the evolution of English is so universal that I should expect it elsewhere. For me, that's a crazy idea. And yet physicists are, I think 90% of my physicist colleagues believe in this idea. They're not biologists. Biologists usually know a little bit better. But physicists think, my brain is so important, that my lineage that produced this brain is so important that I think it should exist elsewhere. And therefore I can talk about going through this sequence of thresholds or the great filter. That whole reduction of the beautiful variety of life on Earth to my lineage and my lineage thinking, the one-dimensional thinking, doesn't make any sense at all. And yet that's what they continue and continue and continue to impose on the rest of the life in the universe. And I say, that's crazy. Your closest relatives are here on Earth. We are the result of one lineage. Look at all these other wonderful lineages, and they are here just like we are. Therefore, we're not any better than them. We're all here together. And matter of fact, we have co-evolved in many ways. And if we pretend that we're separate from the rest of the biosphere, that's what is going to do us in. That's what is going to make us go extinct eventually, unless we realize that we are animals, that we are eukaryotes, that we belong in nature, that nature doesn't belong to us. And that's more or less my spiel on that one.
So would you say then the biggest meaning, maybe personally for you, I don't know, I'm just making a just random guess here, that perhaps the greatest meaning for you is that everything is interconnected in life?
Yes, definitely. But I would put it, the connections are biological and evolutionary, and you can study them by studying biology and evolution. You don't need to take drugs to say, hey, everything's connected. It is true that everything's connected, and our brain has, divides the world up. But all of that, everything that we are, is the result of everything that was, and you can study the pieces as they progress. It's kind of like, what was my grandfather like? What was my great grandmother like? And then you can go, and they were different from you. And then you go back further, and they're different. I think Richard Dawkins has a wonderful metaphor of, imagine your mother holding her mother's hand and her mother holding her mother's hand, and you go back and back and back. Eventually the hands turn into fins. Eventually the multicellular organism turn into the unicellular organism. And so to understand that is incredible. It's mind-blowing. But for some reason, people want to say, oh no, I'm a human being, I'm not an animal. For me, that's the craziest, stupidest idea. It's full of vanity, and it's, for me, meaningless, because you're searching for meaning so much that you're excluding the possibility of understanding who you are.
Right. Okay. So another interesting question is, I'll use a reference here. As a non-expert, your paper was very, I read it, was very interesting to read. It could, I could understand a lot of it, but mostly I go to films, because films are like pockets of ideas, and they contain all these amazing things, thought starters, for example. Have you seen this film called Contact? It came in 1999.
Yeah. Yes, I certainly have. Matter of fact, I interviewed, and one of the questions I asked my interviewees was about this. If there's nobody out there, wasn't that a waste of space? And that's what Jodie Foster's character not only asked, she asked that 3 times. And at the end, you may recall that one child says, are we alone? And she says, well, if we are, it's an awful waste of space. That for me is the epitome of human vanity, because it says, if there is no other human-like intelligence out there, then it's a waste of space. For me, that's crazy. It's being guilty of what I've been yelling about for 10 minutes here. It's saying, if there's no, it's a form of speciesism. It's like racism. So, hey, if there are no my race over there, it's a waste of space. It's like when Europeans came to Australia and say, hey, there are only Aboriginal people here, there are no Westerners. It's a waste of space. It's the same idea, and it's just arrogance. But it's an arrogance that's so misplaced but as I said earlier, it's an arrogance and a vanity that is understandable, because you have been selected to believe that your group is better than the other groups. So it's I would say an understandable, not a forgivable, but it's an understandable attitude.
Right. Yeah. So Dr. Lineweaver, the reason I brought this film into our conversation was there was a dialogue in the film. This is happening during the presidential dinner, and the character of Jodie Foster, she runs into Matthew McConaughey's character once again after a brief period of not being with him. And she says that, I've read your book, and it seems that you're saying that science killed God. And what if science did not do that, but all it did was prove that he never existed in the first place? So now, since this is in context with earlier what we were talking about, that the meaning of life and how tradition cultures give meaning, give it certain understanding of what life means, and then science comes and says this is also what life means, and generally there's a conflict there. So what I'm trying to understand is that, what about faith? There are questions that we haven't asked as a species, that the questions that we haven't imagined yet. Maybe 10 years, 100 years from now, people will be asking questions that we've not even thought of asking. So the unknown, the uncertain. So when you have faith, in something that you have faith because you know that you cannot understand everything, and that faith sustains you. You cannot articulate what you have faith in. You cannot articulate your faith also, but maybe you act upon it. And then what would you say as an evolutionary biologist, the value of faith, whether you're a scientist, non-scientist, what would you say is the value of faith?
Well, first of all, I think faith has a very strong value for human beings, and that's why I call myself not an atheist, but an animistic atheist. And animism is more or less a stand-in for, you could call it traditional religion of all kinds. If you go back before there was writing to, let's say you go back in a time machine, 10,000, 20,000, 30,000, 40,000 years, and you meet 10,000 different tribes, you go to each one of them, none of them will be atheists. They will all fall into a current category that we call animus. So today, when an anthropologist goes to the center, contacts a tribe that has never been contacted before, they are inevitably, they nowhere near atheism. They are animist. They think there's a god of thunder, there's a god of the tree over there, there's a spring over there, that spring has its own god. That's essentially what's called animism. And that is what I hold to be the traditional human religion that is universal. Now, if there's something that's universal about humanity, I, as a scientist, would be very arrogant to say that I am not a human being. I'm a human being, therefore I have these animistic tendencies to put spirits everywhere. And to pretend that I don't have them is just silly. It's like saying, oh, the only part of my brain is a rational brain. That's obviously crazy. We know that most of your brain is the most irrational, emotional, animistic place when you dream, for example. It's just crazy. And so that's who I think I am, and that's what I think a human being is. So faith is what I consider to be this animistic tendency to put spirits in everywhere and to try to explain things. That doesn't mean it's correct, because when I ask the question, is it correct? Then I say, oh, I'm a scientist. I turn on my rational brain and I say, there's no spirit over there. There's no God over there. There's no that. And then I travel around the world and I see all of these mutually inconsistent gods that different groups have invented. And I say, wow, this is wonderful. They're good people everywhere, but they all have these inconsistent gods, and those inconsistent gods have supported them in believing their in-group is better. It's supported them in having tribal conflict and making wars all over the place. Last night, I saw a documentary about the war that's going on in Yemen right now. And a lot of it has to do with Shia and Sunni. Now, these are two slightly different, from my perspective, slightly different versions of Islam. And a lot of their conflict is because of the specific traditions that they believe in. So So religion and faith have helped us understand nature. At least that was our first explanation of this. Why is the mountain doing that? There's a volcano. Holy cow, where did that come from? Oh, there must be a human being-ish thing that we call a God that's in charge of that. So faith is at the same time very, very important to hold our in-group together. It's kind of like believing that you have meaning. You have a faith that your life has meaning, and that has been selected for, but there's nothing scientific about that except for the Darwinian explanation of how it got there.
Okay. So earlier you were telling us about unicellular, single cellular, and multicellular beings, life forms, say. So now, since it began with a single cell, which, if I'm not wrong, again, I've picked this up from a film, it divided, right? And then...
No, I want to take you back earlier. The origin of cellularity may have, there were things that preceded that. There was a molecular evolution that preceded the idea of putting something organized into a bag. Some people think that life got started when you had this envelope called a cell. Other people think, no, there's a long process that preceded that in which molecules evolved without a bag around them. That would be called molecular evolution. But anyway, continue with your question.
Okay, so now if the one thing that universe, I don't know, please tell me here, is the need to survive. I'm not even saying desire, but now that you exist, you survive. Is that common across all aspects, from molecule to this human form that we have? Would you say that isn't what we have in common? The need to survive, Now that you exist, you can try to exist as long as you can. Is that what we share in common with everything?
Yes, but I would not have phrased it the way you did. You say, now that we exist, I'm going to try to survive. Rather, the preferential survival of things that have done things to help them survive is what turned them into something that continues to do what is necessary to survive.
Right.
You see the distinction I'm making there?
Yes. I think so.
It's again coevolution of doing a behavior that helps you survive, then you survive, and then you continue to do that behavior. It's not, oh, I exist, what can I do to keep myself surviving? Yeah.
Perfect. I get that. But see, a molecule, okay, I want to break this before I get to what I want to ask. So a molecule is one of the oldest, what is it? Oldest form of life? What is it?
Well, you use the word life, and I have been quoted as saying, I think we should stop pretending that we know what life is. Mm-hmm. Now, if you look at my arewealone.us website, you'll see a whole week in which I just talk about what is life. And the conclusion I've come, now, the reason I've come to this, I think we don't know what life is because the most common organisms on Earth are viruses. And if you ask biologists, are viruses alive? The first survey I did, half of them said yes and half of them said no. So I said, whoa, this is a really weird thing that at the frontier, the boundary of life, these biologists don't know whether viruses are alive or dead, or alive or not alive. And then I started asking a lot more people, a lot more biologists, the same question. And I realized that it wasn't just two, it wasn't just alive or not alive. They were, a quarter of them said, yes, viruses are alive. A quarter of them say, no, viruses are not alive because they're parasites. A quarter of them say, we don't know. And another quarter, the last quarter, says, that question doesn't make sense. Mm. And the reason it doesn't make sense is because as a scientist, we have an understanding of the origin of life, which starts out with not life. You start out when there's no life, and then something happens. And then today we have something called life all around us. And so we have something that emerges, there's an origin there, and we try to understand that origin, but there is no boundary between non-life and life in that sense. It's a very, this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened. It's kind of like saying, what's the origin of India? Now, if you're an Indian historian, you could say, well, it's very complicated. This happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened, and this happened. And that's the real explanation. Mm. But if you get some Indian nationalist telling you the history of India, it started with Mr. blah, 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 who then founded the Indian nation. That's a simplistic, unrealistic, nationalistic view that has no scientific background. And so it's the same with everything. What's the origin of computers? Oh, Mr. Jobs did this. Say, no, before that, there was all kinds of things. And after that, there are many types of things. So a computer, a nation, a human being, these are all things that continue to evolve. And to ask about their origin is you will get necessarily a complex answer. And if you don't get a complex answer, you're getting a wrong answer. You're getting a really simplified answer that has been simplified for consumption for either nationalistic reasons or corporate interest, or just an explanation that don't make sense.
Okay, got it. So just a second. Earlier the quote that I had quoted from your article, I'd asked you about is it right to say if that is the order of the prerequisites for what was it? Prerequisites for the fact that it took intelligent life so long to evolve is because intelligence was one of the last in the series, right? Of the prerequisite, the four elements that we listed: biogenesis, all that. Intelligence is the last. Is there something that you can tell us here? Is intelligence the last thing to emerge that then can give form to intelligence life, so to speak? And what does it tell us about what is intelligence? What is intelligence?
First of all, many people use the word intelligence as if it's a generic thing, and I prefer to use the word human-like intelligence.
Okay.
Because people are very vain, and they want to think that our type of intelligence is the best type of intelligence. But all you have to do is have a dog and take a dog for a walk, and that dog can smell a whole world that you are completely insensitive to. And so if you want to talk about olfactory intelligence, humans have this much of it. And dogs and elephants, by the way, have even more of it. And we know this by looking at the number of olfactory sensors that they have in their noses. We don't understand anything about smells, and they understand lots more. So to pretend that smell is objectively not an important part of intelligence, I just think is just my species. It's speciesism. My species is better than yours. But you asked questions about this sequence. Again, this sequence is silly because it is my lineage. What happened to in my evolutionary track is more important and more fundamental, and I think more universal than the track that led to this plum tree. Right out there, there's a plum tree. Now, this plum tree and I have a common ancestor about 1.6 billion years ago. That means if I held my grandmother's hand and my grandmother, and it held its mother and its mother's mother, they would merge about 1.6 billion years ago. So to think that my lineage from that divergence point is better than its lineage is just arrogance for me, but it's an understandable arrogance. So you asked about what is intelligence and what's the next step. That's kind of like saying, well, what's the next step for English? Let's forget about all the other languages in the world and pretend that my language is the best one. You can see that that's a very narrow-minded, myopic, I guess cultural. My culture is better than your culture type of view. And I've been pushing back on that as much as I can. But most physicists subscribe to this. Our lineage is the best lineage. Why? Because human intelligence is the best intelligence. Why? And that's why we expect it elsewhere. That is something that I've been pushing back on, because I think every organism has the type of intelligence that has kept it alive during its history. And just because we have this type and they have that type, to pretend that ours is better is just my adaptation is better than yours. That for me is vanity. That scientifically it's stupid, but it's understandable because that's what evolution does. It makes you feel that you're more important than other species. Why is that? Because when you feel that, you will survive more. You'll do more to keep your genes intact.
So then what would be your, because we're talking about, if we keep that way of looking at things, it helps us stay alive longer. And if that is
It does. Traditionally, we humans have been in groups of small groups, let's say 20 to 100. And these groups sometimes competed and sometimes they just killed each other. So xenophobia was a useful characteristic in those circumstances. But then as the world has gotten smaller, xenophobia has now become one of humans' worst characteristics. It was useful 10,000 years ago because it helped you protect your tribe against the other tribes who are going to kill you. But now that we have nations, there's a whole new dynamic and a whole new moral. You have to accept my in-group now is everybody that's in my nation or my culture. That's a much larger group. That's a group that never existed before. Now if we want to survive, we have to say all human beings are in my group. Then if we want to survive in the biosphere without ruining the earth, we have to say, hey, by the way, we depend on all these species around us, all the grass and all the trees and all the other animals, the elephants, and all of this nature is not something that we own, rather we're part of. And so that's increasing this sphere of the in-group. Now that's changing because the world is changing. Right. So it's good that we're flexible enough to do that, but I'm not sure that we are flexible enough to then say we are part of the biosphere rather than I own the earth. There are many, many environmentalists who are going to say we're in control of the earth. I say, well, that's the craziest. It's an arrogant way to approach the biosphere.
Okay, so
it's not helpful, I don't think.
I understand. So something is coming to my mind. Let's see how clearly I can frame this. I remember speaking with my father once about, I don't know what we were talking about, but I remember his response. And it was, how can I keep all these considerations on my mind? It's just too much. I have to draw the line somewhere. Something like that. I have to draw the line somewhere. So now that as a group, like in group and everything that you were talking about, we are including this one also in the group, that one also in the group. And it seems that every time a child is born, the rules that are there for for how you can conduct yourself, they're always either expanding, evolving, changing. So do you think this uncertainty of where to draw the line is, or not knowing that it's not important to draw the line, that there is something that is leading to confusion within us, that how do we walk this strange thing called life through it? How do we walk through it? If we do not know that this is where we are, this is where we belong, and but that the place that we belong is now expanding, and what we are now including seems to have its own rules. So now there is a place where the rules merge and something new evolves, and by the time I get to understand this new thing, something new has been added. And do you think this is leading to, or is it's maybe it's a question of psychology also, that this when we say that we are not superior, that there is that when we thought that we are superior, that kind of gave us some grounding, gave us some footing. Of course, it led to its various expressions led to like you were giving the example of xenophobia. It's an expression of that emotion. It was not good, but maybe it has its value, and now it's time for it to go. But fundamentally, it is there for us. And maybe its understanding might grow, and then maybe we can become more mature adults, more individuals. Do you see what I'm trying to say here, or is just like a all mishmash of some ideas?
I think so. About half of what you said subscribed when I was using this in-group, out-group, and what you just said, part of what you just said, there was a boundary. You said, where do I draw the line? And your father would say, oh, I don't know. It's all too complicated. I need a simple solution to this complexity. But I think one simple solution that seems to work for me is, if you have children, you love your children very, very much. Your cousin's children you don't love quite as much, but you love them. How about your neighbor's children? A little bit less. Your enemy's children a little bit less. And then chimpanzees a little bit less. And so maybe it is the case that genetic proximity is a way to turn an in-group, out-group dichotomy into a one-dimensional continuum, in which you say, well, I love myself and I love my family, and I love, in other words, instead of having an in-group, out-group, you have closer to me, I feel, more sympathy, more empathy for, and further away, I don't. So, for example, when you kill a mosquito, you and I have a common ancestor with a mosquito about 700 million years ago. Now, we could say that's a bad thing to kill a mosquito. On the other hand, wait a minute, they hurt me. And so there's this thing going on about how much is this other species going to hurt me, and how close is it to me? It's a complicated thing, but it's not necessarily an in-group, out-group, not a black and white thing. It's rather genetic proximity is somehow involved in our morality. And I just think you can accept that rather than try to figure out where there's a line.
Very interesting.
Lawyers have a very difficult problem with this because they're saying, oh, humans have rights. And then I said, well, wait a minute, Neanderthals, we had a common ancestor with Neanderthals about 600,000 years ago. And people like you and I have about 1, 2, or 3% Neanderthal genes in us. That means that we are not separate species. That means, in fact, that we could isolate the genetic components that are Neanderthalish and bring back Neanderthals. That would give the lawyers a very hard time, because they say, oh, do they get the right to vote? Do they get human rights? I mean, and then you can say, wait a minute, we diverged from chimpanzees about 6 million years ago. We can make a human chimpanzee hybrid. And they say, well, wait a minute, what does that mean? That kind of blows apart our human-only morality. I mean, the last few million years, there have been many, many human species which we have killed, or they've gone extinct for some other reason. And now we see ourselves, now we can have our own ethics that we apply only to our human species, and every other species we're going to forget about. That's a convenience that is not available if we hadn't killed or gone extinct these other groups. So I think keeping that in mind is very important when you say human rights versus animal rights. It's just a dichotomy that I don't think should exist in anybody's head who knows about Darwinism. But as I said, we live in a pre-Darwinian world.
Okay. I want to talk about alien life forms. Okay. So for someone like me, I get a lot of my understanding of what aliens are, what they might be, from say cinema, right?
That's
And
too bad. That is terrible. That is a vice of the Indian education system that you went through, that you had to do that. They subjected you to Hollywood rather than science.
yeah, but I have I hope I'm not biased that way in what I'm going to ask you. But so say for
I
example,
guarantee you will be, but go ahead.
okay, that'll be
Enjoy your
interesting.
bias. Enjoy your bias. Enjoy.
Yeah, explore it, right? Yeah, get to understand
Yes,
it
yes.
better. So yeah, so say most alien life forms that Hollywood, for instance, has brought to public consciousness are those that are similar to us, that say look like us, but in some sense, and I'm again limiting here, okay, in some sense are advanced. I'm only talking about the alien life forms that are advanced. That Hollywood has, shown us. So they're advanced, maybe let's say in terms of technology, communication. This film, James Cameron film, comes to mind, The Abyss. I don't know if you have seen it. Then they seem to also be advanced in terms of what their purpose is, which was also in contact. If I can say what I'm that it was the purpose that they were advanced in. Then also in terms of their physical attributes, like how Avatar, the film Avatar, another James Cameron film that came out, they were advanced to us in terms of their physical attributes. But there is one film that I've seen that tries to outdo all popular ways of imagining alien life form. It is a film called Annihilation, and it came out in 2018, and it was directed by Mr. Alex Garland. Now, he was asked by in another podcast that what made him do what he did with the form that he gave this alien. So he said, and I'm quoting him here, he said, one of the things that I was trying to do with Annihilation was to offer up a form of alien life that was actually alien. Because it would often seem to me that in the way we would represent aliens in books or cinema or television, any of the storytelling mediums, is that we would give them very human-like qualities. So they wanted to teach us about galactic federations, or wanted to eat us, or wanted our resources, or enslave us, or whatever happens to be, all of these human-like motivations. And I was interested in the idea of an alien that was not in any way like us. And that is, in fact, one of the dialogues in the film. It's not like us, it's unlike us. It may be, continuing on with the quote, he says, it may be the alien life form had a completely different clock speed. Um, you know, what if this alien doesn't have an optic nerve? Maybe its way of encountering the space is wholly different. Maybe it has a different relationship with gravity. It could be a creature created in a quantum mechanical way. It ends up in a very, very different place compared to the one we end up in. So this is what led him to create what he created in the film Annihilation. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's very, very interesting. It's very, very new and maybe even original. So my question to you is, what do you have in mind as a cosmobiologist and as an evolutionary biologist, someone who talks about aliens, let's say, just keep it simple. Like, what do you have in mind when we search for alien life, and what really drives that search?
Well, what drives the search is to find other human beings, I think, and that's why these other aliens are so much like us. They almost inevitably have a head. Unfortunately, I haven't seen this Annihilation film in 2018. I will. But you asked about my conception of life elsewhere. Well, the first thing you have to do is try to define what life is, or what is life? And as I pointed out, we're not quite sure, because we think viruses, this most common organism on Earth, we don't even know if it's alive. Also, there's a quote from Nietzsche that I like to paraphrase, and that is, if it has evolved, you can't define it. So just simply that means that, for example, eyeballs. We have eyeballs, and you say, oh, we can define eyeballs. But then if you go back 400 million years, the things had eyeballs that were very, very different from ours. You go back another 400 million years, you're dealing with photo spots. You go back another 400 million years, you're dealing with pigments that have nothing to do with vision, that have nothing to do with it even sensing light. So when you study the origin of anything, as you go back in time, it disappears. Similarly, if you go in the future, it will also disappear. That's the nature of evolution. Things change with time. Now, so you asked me about my view of alien life. I have more, as a physicist, I think that life is a subset of, now there's some jargon I'm going to throw at you, far from equilibrium dissipative systems. Far from equilibrium means you're not in equilibrium.
Right.
And you're dissipative in the sense that you're creating entropy. And for example, a hurricane is a far from equilibrium dissipative system. What is it doing? There's a gradient of pressure and temperature that then organizes this round and round and round, and it's a structure what it's doing, you could say its function, is to undo gradients, to undo the availability of what's called free energy. Tornadoes, the same thing. A convection cell. If you look at the sun with a telescope, you can see on its surface there are convection cells, much like when you cook spaghetti sauce. You heat it from the bottom, and then you go bloop, 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 and if you do it slowly enough, you get to see these convection cells, and those are what are on the surface of the sun. And the storm on Jupiter, for example, is another good example. These are all examples of far from equilibrium dissipative structures. Now, I think life is a subset of those things. And far from equilibrium dissipative structures are something we see all over the universe. We know they exist. So if that is your definition of life, then we have already detected alien life. And it is very different. It doesn't have a head. But what it does do is create more entropy than would be the case if that thing did not exist. Nature produces these structures that are far from equilibrium by itself when there is a gradient of free energy. There's free energy available. So in other words, you could say that we don't eat food. Food created us to eat it.
I've heard that about water, what you just said. Yeah.
Water is not a far from equilibrium dissipative structure, because there's no, when there's a whirlpool, what that's doing is creating entropy. You could even go further and say the galaxy, a whole galaxy, what is it doing? It's taking these stars, they're going around, they form a bar in the center, and that bar, it looks like the bars, what it's doing is making the things collapse into the center black hole. I wrote a paper about the entropy of the universe, trying to do an entropy budget, and it looks like supermassive black holes have the most entropy in the universe. That means that if there's a dissipative structure that's producing entropy, then that's the thing that's making matter fall into a black hole. That is exactly the structure of an accretion disk, or the bars in a galaxy. So these are my visions of a larger physically definable set called far from equilibrium dissipative structures. We have that ability. That's what we're doing. I eat and I drink. But what we now call life has an extra feature. It has information inside of it. Yeah. That information is able to select and then produce even a better, more entropy producing thing. It's as if hurricanes could vary a little bit and then become a better hurricane and then undo the gradient of pressure and temperature. Sometimes people say stars are the same thing. Stars, what are they doing? They're providing an environment in which hydrogen is hot enough and dense enough so it can access the free energy available in the nuclear free energy to produce helium and then carbon and oxygen. So this is a structure, it's far from equilibrium, that is producing energy and producing entropy. So essentially it's an entropy-based cosmology that is I'm using to define a life form. And that's all.
So would you say this co-creation, it seems to be a process that's prevalent all across everything, right? So is that...
It's like the second law of thermodynamics.
Okay, great. Yes. So this co-creation is perhaps the reason why we will not be able to determine what goal of the universe is?
Well, most people don't ask about the goal of the universe. They ask about the goal of themselves and meaning for themselves. And we've already talked about that, haven't we?
Yeah. But like we said, you were saying, how nature does something, but we do not always know why nature does something. Right. So and the reason why we do not know why is because this co-creation is so organic, and it's happening in there are so many infinite ways in which it can happen, and in so many ways that it does happen, that it's hard to determine where it is going. But perhaps where it is going is a place where if most things are not away from their equilibrium, but are in equilibrium.
Well, in cosmology, we say that the far future of the universe will be a heat death. And the reason we know this and believe this is because of the second law of thermodynamics, and that is entropy is increasing. Now, many people who are creationists think, wait a minute, that's impossible because I'm a life form. I'm far from equilibrium. I'm not near entropy. I'm a low entropy system. And the answer to that is, well, so is a hurricane a low entropy system. That is very, very, very far from equilibrium. If equilibrium is all the molecules going like this, but a hurricane is they're all going like this. So we are that type of system. We're very organized, but we're organized precisely because there is food in the environment that we can eat and then to keep our organization. In the same way, there's pressure and temperature gradients in the environment that allow the hurricane to maintain the structure. But the purpose of that structure is to undo the availability of the gradients, of the free energy. That's what stars are doing. They're getting rid of the hydrogen, turning it into helium. That's what black holes are doing. They're absorbing all this stuff as accreting into them, creating black holes, which have an enormous entropy. So if there's one concept from cosmology that can give meaning to the universe, it is the second law of thermodynamics, also associated with the arrow of time. It's why time goes by. So the second law is a very, very important law because it's the only law in physics where there's an unequal sign, not an equal sign.
Interesting.
And that, I think, is a gigantic clue to the way that the second law of thermodynamics can be used to understand what's happening in the universe and where it's going.
Okay. Okay. So, yeah, I also watched your TED talk. It was titled Science, Humility, and the Fallacy of the Planet of the Apes. It's a very, very interesting, lively talk that you gave. And you also shared, you did in your presentation, you shared the importance of being humble, of humility, and perhaps even the scientific evidence for it, because you said that here is so many other species who don't want to be like us, so just take it easy. So, but
not so many, none want to be. Not so many, none.
Nobody
none
likes
There's a big difference between none and not many.
Yeah, nobody wants to be like us. Got it. Yeah. So, but still, apart from this, what with your time and experience that you've invested in your work, what can you tell us some of the insights that you have gained about what humility really is? Not only what it does and how it's useful, but what it is to be humble. And perhaps, yes, how was it useful?
Well, I think humility can be brought back to this in-group, out-group relationship that we have traditionally had, in the belief that, for example, racism. What is racism? Racism thinks my race, my subspecies of humans, is better than your subspecies. Or when I say human-like intelligence is better than all other intelligence, that's being speciesist. So what was the question? Humility.
Yeah.
So I think as the world has gotten smaller, and I've traveled around the world to see these different cultures, I say, oh, isn't this wonderful? We're all people. And so when you see that there are good people everywhere, the humility that gives you, I think, is to realize I've been taught that I'm the best, my culture is the best, my language is the best, etc. Humility comes from seeing people who don't speak your language, aren't your same subspecies, have a different way of thinking, and saying they're good people too. That's the type of humility that I think is necessary to help get over racism, speciesism, kingdomism, genusism, anything that's associated with I am better than the rest of the world. You're not better than the rest of the world. You're part of the rest of the world. You're the product of the world. And that humility, I think, helps get over the arrogance associated with a biologically selected belief that you are the best.
Very interesting. And I think this will be my last question to you, Doctor. So I'm sure you're aware of conspiracy theorists, bringing in ideas and insights about information and insights about alien life forms. Well, as a mainstream scientist, if I can call you, I know you in that also you're an iconoclast, right? So what would you say? Would you have any thoughts on some of the ideas and insights that they have brought forth about what alien life is like, their purpose, that they've visited? What would you say about that?
Well, I have been on TV shows where normal presenters have asked me about, for example, in the US, they have had these reports about UFOs, and they show blurry videos of this and blurry videos of that. And there's a guy named Mick West, I think, who has done a very careful job of looking at these videos to see what exactly these things could be. And if you're interested in, if you believe that these UFO videos have implied that there are super intelligent aliens that have come to visit us, I suggest you look at his analysis of this evidence. He's looked at it much more carefully than I have, but when I hear the US government and the Navy guy talk about presenting this evidence to the public, I see this guy is not a scientist. He has no idea what's going on. He's just a bureaucrat. He's a suit. He's not a scientist. And the idea of having military people who are concerned with national defense with a semi-paranoid view of, hey, the most important thing is that the Chinese or the Russians don't provide a super technology that we cannot defend ourselves from. With that mentality, that's not a scientific mentality. The scientific mentality is, what is that blur seen in this camera under this angle at this time with this, there are night vision goggles. That's why they're kind of greenish. The fact that these images have not gotten clearer, even though technology has improved so rapidly that it's incredible, that's probably the number one fact that tells you that this is not something that we need to pay much attention to, that it's been hyped up by a paranoia or just a wonderful belief that there are these aliens out there. So I don't spend much time thinking about these issues, but if you want to look at somebody who has, I think his name is Mick West, he's a British guy who essentially reproduces the situation and the cameras and the lighting of these Navy pilots who have seen something they don't understand and then say, oh, it's aliens. Another example of that, we say UFOs. UFOs are unidentified flying objects. I can see unidentified flying objects every day. I see right now there's something out there. Well, it's a kind of cloud. I don't know what kind of cloud it is. Oh, there's a plane. I don't know what kind of plane it is. Hey, there's some object that's kind of blurry. I don't know what that is. So everybody sees these things, but UFOs in our human brains have been associated with aliens. That's a leap of faith that is nuts. It's not scientific, and therefore I don't think about it much.
Okay. So with that, we can conclude this very lively and interesting conversation. And thank you, Dr. Lineweaver, for giving us your very interesting insights on these questions. And thank you for coming and giving us your time on Tatradeep as well.
Thank you for your curiosity.
My conversation with Dr. Lineweaver helped me understand how some of the concepts and ideas that we may hold dear and close to our individual hearts, in their most fundamental attitude, may have been selected through the process of evolution, and how evolution can explain to some degree and at the same time challenge our ideas of who we are, what we value, and what we may find meaningful about ourselves, our world, and life itself. It will be wonderful to know your thoughts on the conversation, and if it inspired your worldview in any way. Thank you for being here. I will see you soon with another interesting mind, demystifying another interesting subject. Until then, take care.